Hey everyone, this is Mr. Wallenfang with another virtual lesson for you all. I enjoy talking to myself in a room all alone to my computer so much that I decided to do it again, and with something even more exciting than commas. This is all about introductory and conclusion paragraphs today so that we can start thinking about how to piece together all of the analytical writing that we've been doing, the paragraphs, the microanalyses, thesis statements, and to give an introduction and a conclusion to all that writing so that we can go ahead and create full-blown essays, which obviously you guys are also excited to do at this point in your high school careers. So what I want to do is start by talking about introductory paragraphs. I'm sure that you guys have gone over this a little bit in middle school. Probably in middle school, we've been using the analogy of training wheels with writing, and you learned it with some training wheels on. What we want to do today is take some of those training wheels off and to start thinking about how we can write compelling, interesting, relevant, and engaging introductions and conclusions to your work so that your readers enjoy reading it. So let's go ahead and start with introductory paragraphs. The first thing that I want to talk about is, the purpose of introductory paragraphs. So if you think about what you want an introduction to an essay to do, the first thing that you definitely want to do is gain your audience interest. So you want them to be interested in what you're talking about. You don't want them to be bored right out of the gate with what your paper is going to say. You also want to give your audience a roadmap for your paper. That roadmap links into what your actual thesis statement is. So when you think about what your thesis statement does, you want your thesis to be strong and specific like we've been talking about and to contain your central argument, but it also is going to give a structure and a purpose and an organization for your paper, which is very important so your reader knows what he or she is reading. The other thing that you do in an introduction is to provide some background for the topic, for whatever you're going to be talking about. And it's important to provide that background again so that if somebody's not 100% familiar with what you're discussing, they're able to know some of the relevant information before they just dive into whatever your argument is. So when I think of introductory paragraphs, I like to think of them in this little visual way. I think of an upside down triangle. And you may have seen this before. If not, that's fine. I'm going to flesh out what this means in just a second. But let's pretend that this triangle represents your introduction paragraph. And what you'll notice is that the base of the triangle, which is at the top right here, let's say, is much wider than the point of your triangle, which is right down here. And what this is sort of a metaphor for is how broad you're going to start. So you're going to start very broad up here, and then you're going to get very specific down here. Now, you're all very intelligent individuals, and you are probably sick of talking about specificity and how specific things must be, but because you've talked about it so often, you know that when you get more specific in an intro, this is probably where your thesis is going to go, and this is exactly it. Your thesis statement is going to come at the most specific point of your paragraph at the very end of your paragraph. Okay, so what do you do with all this beginning information? Well, there are sort of two things that I think that you include in this section. In the very, very opening info, you give us the background information that is necessary for your reader. So some things that you might want to consider as background, for example, definitely you want to include at some point title and author. Depending on what you're writing about, perhaps you want to give us some history about the text or about the author or something like that. If you're going to write about an important concept, maybe some sort of important concept or some sort of theme that you want to bring up at that section. All of those things are going to go into the background piece of your information, of your introductory paragraph, I should say. This central section here then is where you start connecting the background to your thesis. So there's a movement. You start broad, get a little bit more specific until finally you arrive at the most specific space in your paragraph. So this diagram is all well and good, but what does this actually look like when you put it together? It's one thing to make a diagram and use a diagram, but it's another thing to piece this together. So let's take a look at a sample introductory paragraph that somebody could write for Romeo and Juliet, which is what we've just finished reading. So here's an introduction that serves this purpose. William Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet has become a timeless story of love, loss, and redemption. Despite its fame, however, many criticize the fast nature of Romeo and Juliet's relationship. Taking place over the course of only a few days, their quick marriage seems like a rushed event. Although they were truly in love, Romeo and Juliet's relationship existed in a world of passion rather than a world of reality. So if we take a look here, this paragraph follows what we just set up. I'm going to start right up here. This first sentence kind of goes along with the very broad background information. I'm naming the author, William Shakespeare. I'm naming the play, Romeo and Juliet. And I'm talking about a concept, right? Love, loss, and redemption. Then I'm going to go ahead and get a little bit more specific. I'm going to talk about the fast nature of Romeo and Juliet's relationship, and that's what I'm a little bit more interested in. And then finally, once I talk about the fast nature of this timeless play, then I'm going to move into my thesis statement, which was in bold at the bottom, right? Although they were truly in love, Romeo and Juliet's relationship existed in a world of passion rather than reality. And all of this stuff connects back up, right? If I trace this idea of passion rather than a world of reality, that fits in with the idea that, they like got married in 24 hours. So this whole paragraph fits together sort of seamlessly because I start broad, I then give an idea, and I move into my thesis statement at the very end, which is my most specific point. Now, a couple of things that you'll notice about this paragraph, things that I avoided and that you all should avoid as well. Using some sort of a cliched attention getter. So saying something like imagine yourself, or opening with one of those really canned rhetorical questions, have you ever, or would you ever, what would you ever do if, blah, blah, blah. First of all, you don't ever, ever, ever want to use personal pronouns. So if you find yourself saying imagine yourself or imagine you, that's really going to make me that very sad because we know that we're past that at this point in time, right? So just go ahead and jump right into it like I did in the previous example. William Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet, blah, 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 blah. Get to your point, okay? All right, so let's move on then to conclusion paragraphs because these ideas are really linked, intros to conclusions. We'll start again with the purpose of a conclusion paragraph. I want to talk first of all about what a conclusion is not. This is where I think you may be familiar or you may have to kick off some of those training wheels that you learned from 8th grade or from middle school. A conclusion paragraph is not just a restatement of your thesis and your intro. I find that a lot of kids come in and they want to just restate everything that they already said in their papers, but I mean, that is so boring, right? If I read this really well-written, insightful essay about Romeo and Juliet or of mice and men or poetry or something, and then I get to the end and the final paragraph simply just restates everything, what a letdown. It's like, if I were driving towards a cliffhanger and instead of actually finding out what happened after, I simply just drove off the cliff. That is what a conclusion that just restates your introduction does. So we want to keep in mind that a conclusion does not just restate all of this information. Rather, what it does is it reestablishes your ideas to your reader. So you don't just take your thesis and put it back into your conclusion paragraph. You restate the idea without restating the exact words. The other thing that you do in the conclusion is that, this is your chance to have your reader walk away feeling like they learned something from your essay. So you want to think about what's the last thing that I want my reader to think about or to feel when he or she finishes this essay. So this could be a new idea that you sort of just leave them pondering or some sort of question that you sort of establish, not a legitimate question like, oh, blah, 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 do you feel this way about Romeo? Nothing like that, but something that you want your reader to continue thinking about as he or she finishes your essay. So as we think about this, we can also go back to this analogy of this paragraph looking like a triangle. So, for example, you'll notice this time that it's inverted. It's more of a correct triangle, right? The top is the smaller part, the base is the wider part, and just like you would imagine for the introduction, it works the same way for the conclusion. The top is going to be, oh, I have to get my pen back. The top is going to be a little bit more specific, and the bottom is going to be a little bit more general. Okay, so what does this look like for a conclusion versus an intro? Well, what I have taken to calling this first part is sort of a capstone idea summary. And what I mean by this is instead of saying this is where you restate your thesis, because it's not, what you do instead is you sort of reintroduce the idea that you've been looking at throughout your whole paper in this section here. Okay, you reintroduce the idea. You don't copy and paste your thesis statement and put it right here. You don't change 2 words in it and feel like you've changed the whole thing, but instead you reintroduce the idea itself in new language. Okay, so that's our capstone. We're going to look at that in just a second and see what that looks like in actual writing. And then what you move towards in the end of this conclusion is what you want your reader to, I'm just going to abbreviate this here because I'm terrible at writing on this screen, what you want your reader to walk away with. Okay? What do you want them to think about or to feel after they read your paper? And that's what you should leave them with at that point in time. So let's take a look at what this actually looks like in real life. I just want to reintroduce this introduction again because the conclusion that I wrote pairs with this introduction. So let's take a look at this one more time and then we'll take a look at a conclusion and be all set. So again, the intro is William Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet has become a timeless story of love, loss, and redemption. Despite its fame, however, many criticize the fast nature of Romeo and Juliet's relationship. Taking place over the course of only a few days, their quick marriage seems like a rushed event. Although they were truly in love, Romeo and Juliet's relationship existed in a world of passion rather than a world of reality. And again, the bolded part is my thesis. Okay, so if I were to pair this with a conclusion, here's what it would look like. Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet certainly deserves its place as a classic tale of love. However, the love that the protagonists share is not rooted in reality. Instead, both Romeo and Juliet exist in a world of fantasy and passion, choosing to ignore logic. Consequently, they are fated to die because of their ignorance of the way the world works, and the play becomes a cautionary story about the dangers of abandoning reason. Okay, so let's go through our checklist again. This first part here, specifically, this section here, is my capstone. And that means again that I'm restating, I'm reintroducing my ideas. I'm not restating my words, right? I have repeated words of fantasy and passion from earlier, but those are the key words to my argument that I should have, but I did not just copy and paste my thesis and put it down here. You'll notice that this is also a good time to reintroduce the author's name and the play's title in case you haven't used it in a while, so that's good to have here as well. And then here's what I have my audience walk away with. The idea that because they're fated to die because of their ignorance of the way the world works, what this play actually is a cautionary story about the dangers of abandoning reason. And that becomes the idea that I want people to walk away with. I've talked about that in the essay, or I would assume I have since I haven't written this essay yet. But now my audience can walk away thinking like, wow, this is really the important point. What happens when we live in a world without reason? Well, we live in a world of fantasy then, which is what Mercutio's speech demonstrates in this play. Okay, so this is an example of what a conclusion could look like. Again, it doesn't just restate my intro, it complements my introduction. So, in a conclusion, what else do you want to avoid? Just like in an intro, what do you want to avoid? Again, you want to avoid cliche stuff, right? So you'll notice I didn't stop by saying in conclusion, or to conclude, or this is the end, period. Maybe you're feeling really awesome that this is the end, but you don't need to just state that at the end here. Rather, go ahead and, you can play with it a couple of different ways. I started by reintroducing the author and the title. I could have changed it just to say Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet demonstrates that the love the protagonist share is not rooted in reality. I could change my wording however I want to fit my purpose, but I do keep in mind the fact that I'm not saying in conclusion or to conclude or finally or any of that stuff because it's just a little cliche. I don't end on any questions. So I'm going to add that to this list actually. Don't end on any of those big rhetorical questions that you want people to think about like, oh, have you ever lived in a world of fantasy? Don't do that. It sounds a little corny and it's not going to do anything for your paper. Okay? So the last thing then to think about as we start working with intros and conclusions is the visual. So again, as you look from your intro to your conclusion, there is a movement from very general here to very specific, and then in here would be all of your analytical paragraphs that explore the specificity, and then we move from the specific again to the very general at the end. Okay, so I hope that that makes sense. We're going to take a look at this more in depth tomorrow, so bring in your questions and your comments, and we will continue working from there. Have a good night, everyone.